The reality that I see, I mean, quite often I'll hear an executive say, metaphorically, come over here and look in our big idea cupboard. It's empty. There's nothing in there. And often the question is, how can we create more innovation? And the reality is there's tons of innovation going on inside most organizations. But as you just said, it's all incremental. It's all stuff that can coexist with business as usual. And it should. You need that stuff. But I think you're right. When you talk about the bigger ideas, the things that are going to keep us in business in 5 years' time, the system is not set up for those ideas to succeed. I mean, they're dead on arrival in many cases because there's no process, there's no budget, there's no team, there's no way of measuring whether these ideas even make sense. So I agree in that I think it's important to have definition, but I'm really careful not to get too into conversations about detail until that matters, until we have to start making differentiations. I just want to get people moving, succeeding, understanding that this stuff can work, and then we can crank up some of the language based on their own terms as well. I mean, the number of times I've been told, if you say the word innovation here, you won't get hired, because they've just had 12 months of disaster with innovation. So you call it what it needs to be called to get your foot in the door so that you can help them. I guess that's my experience anyway.
Yeah, I've seen too many innovation programs that they run for 2 years, and then the FD comes along, looks at how much been spent for the last 2 years, said, and you got what out of it? And because nobody decided to measure things at the beginning, have no answer to what they got for 2 years, and the program gets shut down.
Yeah.
So the measurements is definitely one thing, and which is a challenge by itself. So I think, we started already to talk about so-called hygiene factors, things that should be in place as a baseline, as basic level of things in place to really be able to grow anything. And oftentimes, unfortunately, organizations don't seem to really have those things in place. So even if you can grow them, one of the things I would say is that when I compare the projects I worked on that had a better chance and less of a chance to succeed, I think one of the biggest thing there was this idea, when you mentioned we don't have a vision, we don't have a big idea here, the big ideas tend to need time and people to grow. And on the opposite side of that, as you just mentioned as well, there's a lot of people in leadership sitting there getting quite nervous and impatient very quickly, going, well, you got 6 months and then you better have a return of investment of something, because we done just one for 6 months or 12 months and nothing came back. And the tricky part there often is because those new ideas haven't even been validated yet, haven't even been figured out, like to the point where this might be a great idea, but we haven't proven which kind of business model we will apply to this in order to make it also a business beneficial idea, right? So you got this nearly the paradox between, yes, we want to innovate and we want to do something and we want to bring it into a day-to-day effort to be innovative step by step. And we want to have this big idea which takes a long time, but we want to have short-term return of investment. How does it work in your experience to at least, or having to shift that approach so that you manage expectations enough for leadership to say, you know what, that's fine. For at least a year, we don't expect anything in return, which is one of the stories that we had with a couple of weeks ago with Tom Peters, who's a over 40 years management consulting veteran. He told us about Avis, when the new CEO joined there and actually managed to turn the company around quite successfully. One of his main things was to tell leadership and the board, for 1 year, don't expect a return on our efforts. And if you leave me alone for that year, you'll see something, but in between, you can't. Because anything you do will mess with the effort and that will likely set it up to fail. So what's your experience to maybe manage that expectation more successfully? What can an organization do, or what can you do, the way you can communicate these things?
Yeah. I always talk about calibrating outcome to context or context to outcome. So what is the kind of outcome we're expecting here or that we're aiming for? And if it's big, bold, disruptive stuff, then we have to understand what context is needed in order for that kind of stuff to show up more. And that requires usually dedicated resources. It requires different metrics. It requires the pursuit of learning over, making finished products, all the stuff we know. And I think when you start to divide out, despite what I just said about definitions of innovation, I think if you help people divide at least between incremental innovation, stuff that we know, cause and effect, well understood, that's all good. As soon as we're starting to move beyond understanding the context, understanding the problem, and certainly the solution, and making that differentiation and saying we need different contexts here and your expectations need to be different, and help them see the flow, because often, certainly in my experience anyway, executives and senior managers have never really had a lot of experience in how to manage innovation. Fantastic at running the status quo. They may have been on a half-day beanbag session somewhere as part of an innovation development program, but they've never really had to get their hands dirty with managing the uncertainty of a more discontinuous environment. So once you start to paint a picture of what needs to be true in order for this stuff to show up, the kind of metrics we might need to follow, the kind of processes that will be different from the status quo, that for me, I've certainly seen light bulbs go off, just showing them the how, which is often what they're buying, or at least asking for help with. So I think for me, that is very much the starting point, that whole conversation around what would need to be true in order for this to show up, work back from the resources, the processes, the people, the leadership, the culture that's required, and involve them in that conversation. And then you get to co-design the context, part of which is the measures. So you're helping their light bulb gradually come on as they start to design what that desired state looks like, that desired context. I guess that's the way that I've seen this stuff happen most successfully. I get this, but there's another way. So that's the first way. That's the ideal world. You're talking at a senior level, and you're getting buy-in, and it's a top-down beginning. The other is you just can't get any traction with leadership, and you start bottom up, and you teach teams experimentation. So you teach them to, the old, becoming a cliche now, dream big, start small, learn fast. You teach them how to run these experiments that generate data that you can then go to a leadership team and say, guess what? We've done 3 spins of this experiment. We haven't spent any money yet, but we've learned this. Can you now switch on some resource? And they lean forward and go, you did what? You pursued that really bold, uncertain, difficult idea, and you haven't done anything that would make us think you need to be fired or at least demoted. We want to congratulate you for taking a step into something that we have never really been able to do as an organization before. So when you switch on experimentation at a lower level inside the organization, I've certainly seen that start to stoke an appetite amongst senior level for a more strategic conversation, because finally they're saying, hang on a minute, this innovation stuff really can work. No one needs to get fired for what these guys have just done. How can we switch more of this on? And then you can have a conversation about, well, let's think about a strategic framework in which experimentation can show up. So I guess top down, bottom up, ideally working together, but I've seen success in both routes.
When I was doing an innovation program about 6 years ago, I had what I called the 3 knives that came after every good idea. And the knives were called legal, regulatory, and compliance. And the company was indeed a big pharmaceutical company. And so there were all kinds of things. But anytime anybody had an idea, like, shall we talk to a patient? No, we can't do that. There was just legal, regulatory, and compliance were the 3 knives that would come after and try to kill any idea. So I like the idea of growing it from the bottom up and doing it in a way that doesn't get you fired.
That's really interesting. I always remember a story that Eric Ries, the author of Lean Startup, telling on a podcast somewhere. And he tells this story of how this finance guy, who was always one of those knives you just talked about, became an innovation hero because he was invited into a conversation sooner and was shown the opportunity, but was witnessing, was part of a conversation where this product team was saying, well, our hands are tied. The law says that it was a legal guy. The law says that we can't do X, Y, and Z. So this product is dead in its tracks. And this legal guy sits up at the back and says, well, what you don't know is that there are exceptions to this. And under these circumstances, you can. And so he became the unblocker. And I've seen that show up in many other contexts as well, where you bring in cross-functional team from the start with a shared business objective, and they are there. I love it with engineers. You sit back and you say, well, this just couldn't be done, could it? There's no way of doing this. That's like a moth to a flame in for an engineer, because they love to solve problems. So in inviting people in, I think in the right context, in the right way, and sourcing their expertise as problem solvers rather than blockers is another way of thinking about that.
So I had similar experiences over at a bank I worked over a year ago, and I think that's it's sort of a nice one, isn't it? Not just to really spread the idea of saying, as far apart as people are. I mean, we've just been recently talking on another recording about, creativity and the bottom line, or creativity and finance, these kind of things, and that's probably the as far away as you can get in terms of having sort of fluffy ideas. Some are very qualitative, and especially if you're looking at customer experience and customer value on the emotional aspect of that, which oftentimes, if not always, really hard to measure. But on the other side, you have finance, which is really just hard numbers. And we had a similar experience during an ideation session where we invited someone from the finance aspect of even a bank with their laws and regulations. It was the same thing where some idea came up and the person said, actually, I think we can do this, around that corner. That's legal enough, or it's totally doable. And so it's and I love those moments where you realize that often within an organization, out of most ideation sessions or collaborative sessions, people come out like, oh, we should have do that more often, right? It's a really nice way of, not even if any single idea even gets unblocked, sometimes the type of conversations people just have, which they're normally never allowed to have because of all the vertical silos in all these organizations, is really a big contributor. But when I then talk about and ask you maybe if how to measure is not even there today, how willing in your experience, or how relevant is it then to get some time from the leadership or from some of the people to say, we need a baseline. If we don't have a baseline, we can't measure the impact afterwards. So we don't even know how well we've just done something if you don't give us time for a baseline. And oftentimes I've found organizations either not having a baseline or not being willing to spend time to do that, and rushing straight into a solution. And then you have the solution and you're quite uncertain even about the impact of that. What's your sort of experience, or how did you tend to tackle that?
Yeah, it's another tricky one in the appetite at a senior level to do innovation at different strengths, let's say, I think is a really delicate balance to strike. I find when I'm talking to in organizations to begin with, as I said earlier, I try and keep it simple and not sound too scary. But ultimately, there does come a point where you have to start getting a little bit more sophisticated. Otherwise, the whole thing starts to fall to pieces because we can't measure. And ultimately, if we can't measure this thing, it's going to fail. So I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer, but generally, I try and help. Stage one is introduce experimentation to leaders. And to be honest, that it's been the single most powerful and effective tool for unlocking innovation inside organizations is the breakthrough of the idea of experimentation, because it lowers the stakes, and all of the benefits of experimentation. And in that process, starting to talk about data. So you want your teams to come to you with the highest possible quality data so that you can make the highest possible quality decisions about investment for the future of this company. So what kind of data might that look like? And you kind of brainstorm it with them and help them to understand what data they would need in order to be able to validate an experiment, or at least unlock the next gateway of money or whatever it needs to be. So I found helping them be part of that also helps them recognize the business need to do this properly. And I guess this is completely off the top of my head, my strike rate is 50-50. You see people who totally get it and say, yeah, you're right, we do need to allow the time and the scope for this. We're going to need to change our mindsets a little bit around this. We're going to have to develop a little bit more patience around bigger ideas or more uncertain ideas, when usually they've had one of two fates, which is we kill it as soon as it's born because it looks too scary, or we don't know what to do with it, so we put it in a cupboard and pretend it doesn't exist for 12 months and we suffocate it to death. And so helping a leadership team adjust a mindset, I think, is the first one. The second one, though, is, and this actually came through working with a finance director in a big drinks company, and that was, he came in, did exactly what we talked about earlier, and said, hang on a minute, this innovation stuff is great, but what does it mean? How much value is it actually creating? So we worked with him just in the first instance to set up a really simple spreadsheet, which was really, what is the project? How is it aligned to strategy? What is the intended value creation here? What's the experiment? What's the spend so far? Who's the team? What's the progress? What's the next step? So a basic dashboard to give everybody at least visibility to see what was going on. I mean, this is really 101 stuff, but it was a helpful starting point for them. And begin that way and help the measure be, qualitative and quantitative, I guess. This is the thing I find all the time with innovation is it's going to be a bit messy. There are no one size fits all solutions in my experience. There are principles, but you need to do some work yourself to make that principle show up in a way that makes sense for your unique culture. And often there isn't. This is often the issue for me. There's no patience for that. It's, oh, come on, we brought you in to give us the answer. It's like, well, we can try and do what Google do if you like, but I would rather recommend the principles that Google use and make them culturally appropriate here so that they've got more chance of showing up.
Yeah, and it's also that. Yeah, so I think it's really nice what you said. And I'm not going to straight jump into, but I want to do that maybe in a question or two about all the areas of value experimentation can bring, because you have really lovely breakdown of that, I think on page 169 to be specific, which I want to actually print and put on my wall. Really, but what I actually want to talk about is exactly what you just said. To sit down with someone like finance or someone and basically go, right, you want to do this and you don't understand what the value is. Well, I find that probably one of the most beneficial things to go through this checklist of the 5 major points of agreement to say, right, we'll need X amount of people, we'll need X amount of training, we need X amount of time. We expect this to be of that kind of value. We might be looking for those kind of business areas or strategy elements or value elements to increase, or at least to be focused on, and see if that holds up and if we can do something about it. But what also comes to that's my question now is, so apart from that, this checklist I find amazingly valuable, and it's amazing how many organizations don't even have that down or don't really take that steps to at least set that up or have some understanding about it, about the maturity levels of these elements. However, you mentioned the Bain lists of values, or Bain's elements of value, and I'm familiar with the Bain pyramid of values. I don't know if they're the same, but also in general, because you just mentioned business value. Can you talk a bit about that, how that correlates, if that's correlated or connected?
Yeah, I mean, so I talk usually to leaders about a couple of things. One is, how can we reduce the risk of innovation, and how can we reduce the stakes of innovation, which are two subtly different things. And they usually get leaders' attentions very quickly because that's what we want to do more of. So reducing the stakes for me is about how can we take a smaller first step, and that's experimentation. Reducing the risk is, how can we also look at what is changing in the marketplace, and there's no shortage of change, and there's no shortage of change coming our way, but also looking at what is changing much more slowly and actually what isn't changing at all. And the framework that you talked about, the elements of value, which is displayed as a pyramid, I think they put it together back in 2016, 17, something like that. So Bain is the management consultancy. And if you Google Bain's elements of value, it'll come up with a Harvard Business Review article, and they've got a ton of stuff on their own website as well. But it's basically, it's based on the jobs to be done methodology, which if listeners haven't come across, definitely check that out. If you Google jobs to be done, you'll find Clay Christensen, you'll find Alan Clement, you'll find all kinds of people talking about it in slightly different flavors. But ultimately, it's the idea that people don't buy products, they buy progress. And in any context, a customer is trying to make better progress in one of three dimensions. It's functional, so help me do something better, faster, cheaper. It's emotional, help me to feel something, help me to believe something. Or it's social, help me find a way to be better socially connected or get a deeper social connection with somebody. So example I use in the book is, you've got a teenager on Amazon looking at skateboards. Why is he buying a skateboard? It's basically a set of wheels connected to a board. Well, is it to learn to skate? Yeah, probably. But why is he learning to skate? Well, maybe he wants to be part of a tribe that he can only get into if he can skate. It might be he wants access to the skate park. But why does he want access to the skate park? Well, it might be there's a girl in the skate park who he can only get access to if he's part of a tribe, and therefore can get into the skate park and have credibility and get close to this girlfriend. And so you start to think about, well, there are lots of jobs that a skateboard is doing here. And it may be when you start to think about that through a progress lens rather than a product lens, you think, if I'm a teenager wanting to ultimately get in front of this girl, the skateboard is a means to an end. What progress am I really buying here? And how can a skateboard manufacturer help me make more progress that is going to make it more likely that I buy your product? So you might think, well, it's speed of being able to do some tricks so that I can join that tribe because I get the credibility because they can see I can do a few tricks. So how can you help me? What's your speed to trick ratio, manufacturer? Give me a YouTube channel or exclusive access as part of the package, which teaches me to do something in 2 days rather than 2 weeks, because it's all about speed to tricks. Or is it? Is it actually about speed to dating? So, it's speed to tricks, but also you might want to start selling or providing services that help you talk to girls if you're an awkward teenager. There's all kinds of things that you can start to do. So the idea is that you're building out a model in the mind of different customers who are trying to make similar progress, break down the progress into different categories, understand how well served current solutions are at delivering that progress, and then aligning your innovation with the pursuit of better progress. And quite often inside organizations, the pursuit is increment on today's product, which again isn't wrong. We need that. But when we start to ask people for bigger ideas inside an environment that is set up to make more of the same, it's really hard to propose something that's any different from what we already make or isn't too far from what we make. Even though if we look 5 years into the future, we can see different trends coming together that could create some very different ways in which people want to experience value creation. So I really like the progress view of the world around how we develop products, because it does lower the risk. And there's a gathering body of evidence starting to show that organizations that design products based on the progress rather than technology and product dimensions are actually delivering higher levels of productivity and profitability. And it's the Netflix way of thinking, really. It's, Netflix set up with a stated ambition to help you find the best movies. They don't care how you find them, really. They're quite agnostic about how you do that, because they know in 5 years' time, there may be some completely different model on how people access movies. So they went from DVD to streaming, and I'm sure it was more difficult than we read it was behind the scenes. But they knew that if they hung on to DVDs, there would be just another blockbuster. So the pursuit of progress into the future allows you to let go of your hold on today's technology, which ultimately you're clinging to what might kill you. You're holding it more loosely. You're serious about it. You're doing great product development, but you're more interested in how do we help that customer make more progress in that context, however it needs to be. Because if we don't do it, you can rest assured there'll be somebody else out there who does. So that's a very quick run around what the key idea is.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the biggest things and trends I've been seeing, and I like to explain it because I saw it in different pockets popping up over the last 20 years. And it probably started somewhere around when Joe Pine was writing The Experience Economy, where he went from just a service delivery and comparing a McDonald's coffee. There is a very transactional way of getting a coffee. You get it quick, it's hot, it's coffee, there you go. You pay $1 something for it. And then Starbucks came around and said, well, it's not just about I'm handing you out a coffee very quickly. I'm giving you sort of an Italian coffee experience. It's their thing that they had as a brand, and therefore they could charge $4 for it, right? So there's actually the margins and the value you're bringing across seems to quite increase, if not sometimes exponentially, when we're looking in this kind of what you call progress, if you go out into the bigger problem space, right? So the way I like to talk about is saying problem space, and I'm saying, well, you're getting closer to trying to solve a wicked problem, not just a tame, simple problem, and a tame problem being something you can manufacture in 1,000 identical times in mass production. I can give 1,000 people a skateboard, but can I actually help 1,000 people, like you said, learn a trick in order to impress your friends or a girl? Can I get them closer to that? That's a much more complex type of problem that is needs to be quite personalized at times. So it's the thing where I can see the evolution of services or what organizations are providing is exactly what you're calling that progress model, and I call it solving wicked problems rather than tame problems. And that's sort of the new opportunity space for companies, because now we have technology and especially the communication networks and apps and websites and everything we have that actually enable us a little bit more to, for example, give someone a personalized tutorial on how to skateboard. If I just looked a couple of weeks back, I think they finally got Tony Hawk to do a skateboarding tutorial on, was it Masterclass, that
Yeah, I saw
website?
that. Yeah.
And it's like, this is totally insane, right? So you can now pay a little bit of money, quite cheaply, I think considerably, to have a session, sort of, with Tony Hawk, one of the best skaters in the world, to be taught by him about certain things, which is amazing if you look at sort of the emotional solution space you talk about in this sense. So I find that an amazing big trend that sort of is not always described like that, but if you go from service to experience, and I would say to the wicked aspect of things, then you're getting probably into the future of what organizations should be providing. Similar in banking, I've seen that when you go from, as you said, they're stuck with the product thinking, and they give people a mortgage. But what people actually need and would probably pay more for is to help them save money. And we're in a time where there is probably a massive value, for companies to tackle it. And you see the new companies like Moneybox doing exactly that. They focus not on giving you an account. That's a commodity. They focus on behavioral science to nudge you, to help you become a saver.
Yeah.
And it's brilliant. So I'm totally agree. I think it's one of the biggest values we have here, probably the biggest focus areas for any future innovation. Less technology, but as an enabler for progressing into those kind of problem spaces for organizations. Yeah, I think it's a very important subject matter.
And taking the idea of progress and moving on, a lot of the work that I do with both enterprises and with startups is in helping them communicate their value proposition. And I try to tell them you have to express value as one or more of 5 things. How does your product or service help them make money, save time, add joy, or remove pain? And if you're not describing your product or service in that terms of, or the language of value, you're probably just describing features. Is it a wooden skateboard? Are they acrylic wheels? And tell me about the bearings, because all of those are just features. The value is adding joy by getting a date with the girl at the skate park.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. That's a great way of framing it.
So in terms of then getting this to companies, and I maybe want to bring up again the value of experimentation, because you talked a lot about it's sort of one of the quickest and easiest way, even without initial leadership support, which unfortunately is often missing to some extent or has different expectations. Tell us a bit about some of the values and how you would normally implement that. If I would say, right, I am not the leadership level, but I'm sitting managing a delivery team. I want to improve that. I want to hit my targets better. I want to, help improve the product or service, whatever it is. How would you start going about to say, right, let's do experimentation and focus on what kind of initial values and
Yeah.
What would the shift be? How does that tend to look like?
Well, I guess I've seen this at two different levels. One is a divisional head or a line manager who's got a team or a few teams, and they're wanting to do exactly what you've just said. And the way that, at least that I've done this, is I've gone in and spent a couple of days with them, basically teaching them about experimentation, some thinking around jobs to be done, some basics around business model design, and give them enough to be able to walk around. Is it the design thinking methodology of desirability, feasibility, and viability, and help them to start getting familiar with the language and some of the tools in that toolkit, but then very quickly turn the attention to what are the most pressing problems that they have right now, and helping them to categorize some of them, to explore them a little bit, but just get them to the point that at the end of those couple of days, they have an experiment that's been as accurately framed as they believe they can frame it. They've got the tools to know what to do for the next 14, 30, 60 days on how to go out and to start to practice this stuff. And that's the thing for me, is get people doing this as quickly as possible. And I can stand up for a week, as you guys could, and teach on this stuff. For most people with the best will in the world, just like learning anything, you're only going to remember 10% of it. So the quicker that you can get on and start getting your hands dirty with this, the better. So for me, it's less is more. Get people to a point where they can do just enough to do an experiment, and then coach them through those first few iterations so that they can understand what a good experiment looks like, what a less good experiment looks like, what data is helpful, what data is theatre, and help them become good or proficient at running experiments, particularly in their context. And one of the things that I find is happening more and more is not just teaching the experimentation, but a little bit further down into the process, when they've been running some tests, is how to play back those tests. So the stakeholder engagement piece. And in the book, I talk about 4 stories that you need to be able to tell. There's a 5-second pitch, a 30-second pitch, a 5-minute pitch, and a 20-minute pitch, all of which have different uses, so that you can move your story, move your stakeholder to a point where they're more likely to say yes, or at least give you some time to get it to the next step. So that would be at a team level. And to be honest, the other context is in leadership development programs, where you've got often organizational development people, or learning and development, leadership development people, who look across the organization, look to the future and say, oh my goodness, we are just not there from an innovation capability. The leadership team doesn't really seem to get how much we need this. With the authority I have, I need to create some kind of program that is going to set this thing on fire. So I've worked a lot with leadership development teams, helping design programs that allow what I just described to happen at scale. So you have teams of 3 or 4 cross-functional teams, times 15 or 20 out in the organization across the same 60-day period, running tests, having been on a quick boot camp to learn the skills, and then allowing. So what's really interesting is when you get a team doing that, you get this innate curiosity from other parts of the organization leaning over the office divider saying, what are you guys working on? What's this experiment thing? And it draws people's interest, because you can see there is energy, there's excitement, there's low risk, there's, and often it's connecting people with the reason they got into the business in the first place. It's pursuing the future of the industry. So I think a little bit of training with a real problem to solve that gives them a point of reflection, so that they can then run another one more effectively, and almost make the MVP process a giant experiment in its own right, where we're creating a way of working that fits into this culture. So that would be where I've seen most progress most quickly.
And I think that you also mentioned innovation theater. And it's one of those things that I struggle with quite a lot, is how people understand how much of it's theater just for theater's sake, and how much is actually showing real results.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a journey I think you have to balance delicately, because I remember working with one organization in the music industry, and we did one of these leadership programs. There was this big playback in New York, and the CEO was there. And he got really excited about, I don't know, it must have been 60 experiments that were being played back. And he just couldn't contain himself. He'd been in the industry, he was in his late 70s or something. He grabbed the mic, went to the front and said, "This stuff is the future and we need to be doing more of this." Now, if you looked at what those experiments were like, the quality of the data, the assumptions that really weren't validated, the money that was being put into ideas that hadn't really cut it, you would not be very impressed. And I learned fairly early on, you need to not be too precious about this. You need to let people at least make 10% more progress than they were making before. And once they've got the appetite, then you can start to coach them around, well, a better experiment might look like this. But, I look back at that experience and think, it was absolutely the right thing not to get too critical at that stage, because the light bulb for experimentation had just gone on for them. They just hadn't learned how to do it well yet, but they did. They got there eventually. So, I don't mind a little bit of theatre up front if the wider goal of it is to create an appetite where we can have a more strategic conversation. But if it becomes, a hallmark of the innovation, then that's a no-no.
Yeah. I've got one last question, and then we're going to kind of wrap up as we're getting kind of the end of the time. You talked about the big idea cupboard being bare, but you also just were speaking about how you can have many, many ideas, not all of which are good. I really believe firmly that you have to keep a record of those innovation ideas, both the good ones and the bad ones, because maybe it wasn't their context at the right time. Maybe the business wasn't ready. Maybe anything wasn't ready. And I'm gonna annoy Marcus, and I'm gonna go back to one of my favorite quotes from Milton Friedman, who said, only during a crisis, actual or perceived, can you actually kind of make real change. And the real change that happens in that crisis is based on the ideas that are lying around. And I did a very short kind of podcast. Well, it was a 3-minute thing. It wasn't even a podcast a few weeks ago, where I said, in the days of COVID, where you're going to have to reinvent your entire business, go back and look at your innovation cupboard. Go back and look at all of those ideas that were not possible for 100 different reasons, and see if any of them are possible now. What do you make of innovation cupboards and old ideas and storing and using them or not?
Well, I think there's two kind of versions of this. The first is, I don't see many innovation cupboards, if I'm honest. They are just metaphors, because one of the biggest opportunities I see inside organizations is much stronger knowledge management capabilities, because often, classic brainstorm or brainstorm season over which, out of which we get one or two big ideas, we might have had 200, and 50 got shortlisted, and then 10 got shortlisted, and then 5 we started to experiment with, and for whatever reason 3 of them are cast adrift. And you ask people, well, where are those ideas stored? Where are they kept? People embarrassingly start to shuffle papers around on their desk. It just doesn't happen. It's in people's minds. That's not everywhere, but I think that's a fairly accurate statement for many organizations, is we don't know where those ideas are unless someone can remember. And often some of those ideas were killed or put down in ways that people don't want to bring them back out on the table again, because the memory of that thing was pretty painful. So I think there's a big opportunity there to get better. And I think idea management software is part of that process. But again, it requires a choice to want to go back. And I think having idea curators inside organizations is a really great idea, almost like idea historians who are keeping track of ideas that had some promise and some way of ranking those and rating those and bringing them out deliberately every 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, saying, we thought this was hot back then, but it wasn't quite right. What do we think now? I think ideas like that would be definitely worth pursuing. But I also think the flip side of the idea cupboard is you get the same old ideas trotted out in brainstorms, and they're either shut down because that's an old idea and we tried that and it didn't work. Yeah, but how did you try it? What assumptions were you really testing? Or it's seen as, well, that's from the past. That's not something that's very interesting. It's not new. And again, some of this depends on the human beings in the room and the line manager and their appetite for wanting new, or actually to go back and bring something back to life, perhaps with a different business model, because this is its time. So I think this is a huge area of opportunity for most organizations to make use of all of those thousands of hours of brainstorming and idea development that effectively get thrown into the shredder after brainstorms. I mean, what a waste. I think it's a great opportunity to explore.
Great. Really, really good answer. Marcus, why don't you bring us home?
Yeah, I think just as a comment to that last one, I mean, it's interesting to see these days that in the era where ideation and human-centered research is becoming a little bit more of a thing, the maturity is slowly growing around some organizations, that they're starting to think about not just creating sort of design ops, but also research ops that start to think about sort of a centralized repository for ideas and research and insights. Again, I think only the big ones at the moment are starting to do it. Maturity level is quite small. They're still sitting in silos as well. So as you rightly said, I think, it's 2020. We live in an era where data is so easily to be stored and should be more easily be managed. However, given organizational structures, that's oftentimes not possible. And I wonder what leadership can do to basically request it and say, listen, whenever if you've done something, should be sitting somewhere where we can have access to it, not sitting there on a table going, where is that stuff? Like, I don't know, some dead Post-its in some office space that's long been cleaned up. So it's a shame. And I've been, like probably you have, in tons of workshops where sometimes there wasn't even time to digitize all the Post-its on the wall. And that was always a big shame, because there were always very valuable conversations in those rooms. And I think it's hard to translate them because it's time intensive as well to do that, However, thank you so much, Elvin, for your time. It was a really great, quite detailed, and I think very, very actionable conversation as well, because I think, your book lends itself really nicely to a step-by-step sort of action guidebook. There's a lot in there.
And a lot of really good frameworks are built into there as well. I wanted to compliment you on those.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So it's really nice to see that someone as well, there's a lot of talk around use this and not that, be agile, be lean, use service design, use IDEO's methodology, use Stanford, and people have sometimes a really hard time seeing the difference of those. And it's nice in your book, I think I can probably assume, like, it doesn't really matter, does it? You just take what you can get, what sort of makes enough sense, and just try something. And I think especially the insights around experimentation being a low stakes attempt that everyone can actually do is really great. So thank you so much for your time. I think this was a great conversation, very lovely. And thank you.
Great. Thank you both. It's been a real delight to be here.
Thank you. You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all the episodes' relevant links in the show notes. And please tell us your thoughts and recommend other relevant books for future episodes in the comment section.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.